Hello, and welcome to the first session of Levi Bryant's The Anarchy of Objects. And this is a first part of a two-part seminar. The seminar will last for 1 month. It's called Objects and Regimes of Attraction. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce our instructor, Levi Bryant.
Hi, welcome to the Anarchy of Objects. I'm Levi Bryant. Thank you for being here. Before we get started, a few points about hopefully how this class would go. First, I would request that you don't use the typing function on the screen because it makes it very difficult to follow the class. And so I would hopefully we'll have a lot of participation and discussion in here because it's next to impossible for me to lecture for 2.5 hours. And so this will go best if we engage in discussion. I would also ask that you keep your cameras on. Being the neurotic person that I am, when I just look at blank icons, it makes it very difficult to talk and conduct class. So before getting into the actual material itself, I thought we would talk about the issue of assignments because there's a discrepancy between the course description on the website and the course description on the syllabus as to what the assignments will be. And so the syllabus says that over the course of the semester there will be 4 300 to 500 word mini essays that would be posted on the course homepage on Fridays that we could discuss in the meantime on topics of your choosing, whereas the course home or the News Center website talks about at the end of the semester, I would imagine a week after the class is completed, a 3,000 to 3,500 word essay or longer if you wanted. And so I was wondering if any of you had a preference as to which assignment structure you would like to go with. Obviously, we've already missed one of the 300 to 500 word mini essays in working out the kinks. So any thoughts here?
I guess the...
Pardon?
Sorry, I said I prefer the single paper, personally.
The single paper? Okay, we have one vote for single paper.
I think I also vote for the single paper.
Okay, 2 votes. Robin, nice to meet you finally, Robin.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Others?
I was going to say broken up could be good, but I'm good with a longer paper too.
Okay, or perhaps we could do both options with a fourth 300 to 500 word mini essay the week following the end of the class would work as well. Now, before we get started, I really want to emphasize that I hope that this class is exploratory and that everything is on the table here with respect to the democracy of objects. This was a book that was written in 2010. It was published in 2011. It's quite an odd experience for me lecturing over something that I wrote in this way. Usually I only teach others, so that feels odd. But there's been quite a bit of evolution in thought since that time period, and so for me at least, as one of the programmers in this class, this is an opportunity to revisit a number of those themes, concepts, and arguments and see how well they hold up, how they might be need to be modified, how some of them perhaps should be abandoned, and so on. And so I want you very much to feel that these things can be questioned and worked through. So I thought that perhaps today we would start by discussing speculative realism a little bit, as well as object-oriented ontology. I would probably, and perhaps I have Robin to thank for this, I would probably these days describe my position as an object-oriented materialism, although I'm still trying to figure out what matter is, and so there's a question there. But also how object-oriented ontology differs from object-oriented philosophy. And so I'm not sure how much all of you know about the history of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, but the term was first coined in 2007 at a Goldsmiths conference organized by Alberto Toscano, where Graham Harman, Ian Hamilton Grant, Quentin Musu, as well as Ray Brassier gave talks. And one of the things, this is one of the interesting things, I think, as to how these things work, is that really the name speculative realism, it wasn't given as any sort of label for a shared position that all of these philosophers shared. In fact, they're quite at odds with one another. In fact, it was simply the name of a conference. What name can we give to these events that would be least objectionable to all of the people participating in that event, despite their vast differences in theoretical orientations? And so if we ask the question, what is speculative realism, it's very difficult to give an answer to that question. It's the name of a conference, and if anything unifies these thinkers and subsequent thinkers that have come after them, it's not any set of shared positions, but a shared opposition to what is called correlationism. And we'll have the opportunity to talk about that a good deal over the course of the semester. Right, but when we talk about correlationism, what is it? And I apologize for my camera. It's going to fade in and out as I move around. When we talk about correlationism, and probably many of you are already familiar with this term, what we're talking about is the thesis that being and thought can never be thought apart from one another. It's probably a very familiar concept by this point in time. Is the writing on the board legible for all of you?
Yep.
Not? Okay. And sorry about my terrible handwriting. I drink too much coffee. I'm left-handed and quite nervous to be talking to all of you. So we have this thesis, the correlationist thesis, that being and thought can never be thought apart from one another. And the speculative realists, they claimed that this had been, even if thinkers didn't identify themselves in this way, and it was a term coined by Quentin Musu and After Finitude, as well as his Goldsmith talk, even if these thinkers, or even if they had not characterized themselves in this way, that this had been the dominant paradigm, at least in continental philosophy, since Immanuel Kant. And so what we got was a set of variations on this theme that we never have direct access to a reality apart from mind or apart from culture or apart from language. We can only talk about these two terms related to one another, never these two terms apart. And so there's been this dominance of an anti-realist position within the history of continental philosophy. Now, as with all things, of course, we can find exceptions to this. This is a statistical claim about what's been dominant within continental philosophy, but certainly there are notable figures that escape this in a variety of ways. The new materialist feminists had been thinking in ways, at least in a good deal of their work, that attempted to break this correlation without putting it in those sorts of terms. We can think of people such as Isabel Stengers, as well as Bruno Latour, and I'm sure we could come up with a variety of other thinkers as well. In fact, in the Democracy of Objects, I talk of Roy Basker, who is one that probably, I would say, calls into question this correlationist relationship. And so, you know, Musu, he coined this term correlationism. He said it's characteristic of the history of continental philosophy since Kant. And this generated a great deal of controversy this claim. And I was wondering, before we jump into all of that, what it might be that's so explosive about this critique of correlationism. What might be the worries here with the critique? I know I have my worries with the critique of correlationism, and the democracy of objects, in part, is trying to address these. Any thoughts?
It's just the shifting of emphasis, I would think, between, in critical theory. That would have been, but that's one you identified.
Right, and so we have this issue of critical theory, and maybe, Catherine, you could say a little bit more about that, because I think that there's something potentially very dangerous in this return to a form of realism, something that we've struggled very hard to overcome, and so we need to make space for what the correlationists have seen and continue that legacy in certain respects.
Yeah, this is like a test. I saw it actually on your video.
I'm not trying to test anyone. I'm interested in what some of our correlationist investments might be, right? And so, I think that potentially there are two issues. One's a more arid, abstract, sort of traditionally philosophical, apolitical kind of question. It's a question of knowledge and epistemology. And so, the question, pardon me, I need to turn off my phone ringer. And so on the question, here we have, is it even possible to talk about a reality independent of our language or our perception or our culture? This was a debate that had unfolded over a long period of time in philosophy, perhaps roughly beginning with Descartes, and ending with this general consensus that there will always be filters, right, that interfere with our ability to grasp reality or the world apart from us, and that the best we can do is talk about invariant structures that might be shared by human beings without ever being able to determine whether or not these structures, these features come from us. And in which case reality could be quite different than it is for us, or whether they're true representations of the world as they exist independently of one another, right? And so, if we think about the traditional questions of epistemology, sorry to move around, we can think of a sort of Venn diagram, right, with two circles. And in one circle, we have mind, culture, and language. And in the other circle, we have world or reality. Right, and what we want epistemologically is the point of overlap between these two circles, right? We want representations that hook on to reality, that represent the world as it is. That's what the project of epistemology is here. The problem is that we only ever have access to mind, culture, language. We can never determine whether or not this X is actually representing the world as it is, or whether the X is actually over here, such that reality is entirely constructed by language or power or culture or mind, any one of these variants, right? And so this had pretty much been the consensus in at least continental philosophy in some form or another. In fact, we can even read phenomenology, right, in a sense, as a very humble philosophy, saying, well, let's just abandon this question of reality altogether and describe the sort of universal experiences or structures of experience that we all share in common as the ground of rationality. And so that would be kind of the epistemological issue in a nutshell. But as Catherine brings up, I think that there's a much more fundamental political question going on here. She makes a nod to critical theory. Right, so we have the political question. with what we can very loosely call critical theory, or very broadly call critical theory. And there are a couple of things that might be going on here. On the one hand, if we go back to very, very traditional forms of philosophical critique, all the way back to people such as somebody who's near and dear to my own heart, the great Roman atomist Lucretius, we have in philosophy this project of debunking superstition, right? And so we have the critique of superstition. And I think in its modern form today, even though we're seeing a need perhaps to return to certain critiques of superstition because of the rise of religious fundamentalisms and so on, I think that we could say that modern theory, the variant, right, or the parallel to the critique of superstition we find in philosophers like Lucretius would be ideology, right? The critique of ideology. And so, you know, one reason that the critique of correlationism might be controversial and something that I think that we really should spend a lot of time thinking about as we make this move to these new materialisms and the speculative realisms, if indeed we choose to make those moves, is that, you know, there's something of value here in the critique of ideology, especially if we look at somebody like Marx and his critique of commodity fetishism, but also a critique of a variety of different kinds of fetishes that function to enforce power. And one of the things we might worry about with the new realisms is that they threaten to prevent us from engaging in this sort of critique. When you look at something like object-oriented philosophy, and I'll talk about the meaning of that term in a little bit, you know, object-oriented philosophy has had a tendency to say that, or to suggest or imply that any object that can be named as real is, in fact, real. And, in fact, has an essence. And this will be the next point with critical theory as well. And I think that we need to retain a space where we can distinguish between genuinely existing objects that exist in their own right and objects that, for lack of a better term, we might call fetishes, right? And that threatens to be undermined within some of these realisms. For example, if we say that every object has an essence, and you know, perhaps we even make the claim that every object has a withdrawn essence. Well, let's take the example of the king. Right, you know, one of the most powerful critiques we've had of monarchy, maybe it's not so close to home for us any longer, was that there's nothing in the body or the being of the king that makes him a king. It's the fact that social relations recognize the king as a king that make the king a king. Right, and that's a powerful critique of monarchy that opens the space for a democratic politics or an anarchist politics or a communist politics. If we say that kings have an intrinsic withdrawn essence, that there's something real about kinghood that's independent of its relationship to social relations, it seems as if we've undermined the ability to carry out that sort of critique. Does this make sense?
Yep.
I mean, do we have any comments at that point with that?
So would you say, I wonder about the types of objects, would you say that objects are all material as object-oriented ontologists, or are you saying that there are both immaterial, whatever that would mean, I don't know yet, and material objects?
That implies you know what matter is.
Well, I think materialism never fully knows what matter is. I think that that's an ever, you know, receding sort of knowledge. And I guess, is it Bogna?
Yes.
Is that right, your name? I guess I would like to say, I want to argue that everything is material. But if I'm being philosophically honest with myself, there are all sorts of objects I believe exist that I have a very difficult time saying material. And a good example of this would be numbers, right? Just mathematics, right? You know, where are we supposed to place mathematics in a materialist ontology? It seems weird to suggest that the number 3 or triangleness exist as material objects. But you know, if you think a lot about mathematics, it also seems wrong to say that they're just social or mental constructions. There seems to be a deep truth to these sorts of relationships, and so that seems to suggest that we need a place for incorporeal or immaterial beings. And you know, especially in autocartography, I try to think about, you know, how we might give such an account, but I find that it's very difficult to do so. But you know, Bogdan, I think that you raise a really fundamental question here. You know, when we look at somebody like Latour, especially if you read Irreductions, you know, this early piece of his, and you look at some of Graham Harman's work and so on, there just seems to be this inflation of objects, right? We say, oh, everything's an object and nothing can be reduced. You know, it all has substantial existence of its own. And I think if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the sorts of questions that you're asking is, well, don't we need some sort of line and some sort of way of distinguishing between things that really are genuine objects that have substantial reality of their own and things that might just be products of either the social imaginary or the individual imaginary and so on. And I mean, this is part of how I try to do philosophy. I always try to bring it back to very concrete situations. And if I have my Latour hat on, and I'm a great admirer of Latour's work, but when I have my Latour hat on, you know, I try to ask myself, well, you know, how would we deal with schizophrenia in Latour's universe, right, where we're hallucinating these things, perhaps we're hearing voices, and so on and so forth. If I were a Latourian actor network theorist in the way that he describes in Irreductions, it seems as if, you know, if I were to suggest that those are hallucinations, I'm somehow doing an injustice to the schizophrenic from his point of view, because I'm reducing it to some product of neurology or psychological pathology rather than taking it in its own terms. But maybe we want to take these things in their own terms. And it's not just a question of schizophrenias and bipolar disorder and so on, but we need, in my opinion, we need a robust place for being able to recognize certain forms of bad rhetoric when we think about how ideology functions in the media and in, you know, in politics and so on. It doesn't seem to me that we want to say that everything we're hearing on Rush Limbaugh, if you're familiar with Rush Limbaugh, or you know, Fox News refers to something real. And certainly, you know, if we want to go one step further and risk committing Godwin's fallacy, I don't think we want to make the claim, and Latour would seem to require us to make the claim. I don't think we want to make the claim that that there was a Jewish conspiracy, right? And so we need, in my opinion, some sort of dividing line, right? We want realism, but we also, in my opinion, maybe I shouldn't use the royal we, maybe some of you are more radical or promiscuous than I am with respect to the objects you think exist. I think we want to be able to retain some of this critical force to call into question those sorts of things. Yes? I think somebody has their finger.
Yeah,
Jordan.
I would push back on that. This is Jordan Peacock, yes.
Yeah, no, good to meet you.
Thank you for the chili recipe. I want to push back on that a little bit because I don't think that those are necessarily opposed concerns. I think where your concern actually is that there's a reticence to issue judgments from a subjective position. So, you know, in Latour's perspective, you're always operating. You know, when he talks about opposing creationism, he says, you know, creationism is a thing, but the problem is that in order to have a successfully, rhetorically successful creationism, you'd have to convince the rocks to not be in the formations that they're in and so forth. So the idea there is of opposed networks where one is much more robust, many more nodes, many more actants than the other. And that's what I see in a lot of object-oriented philosophy as well, where you have the idea that there is an object of a king, you have the idea that there's a conceptual object of kingness. That doesn't necessitate that kingness inheres in the king. You might have people who make that claim, but epistemology at this point becomes a kind of a rhetorical thing where you're trying to convince other people, other things. So that gives you an explanation for schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is basically a weak network in the same way that creationism is, where I'm convinced of my own reality, but nobody else is. Does that make sense? So I think the problem is that we're discomforted by the fact that we can't make a stronger claim than my network's bigger than your network.
Right. And I mean, that's a much more challenging or charitable, pardon me, interpretation of actor network theory, right? To see it in those terms, the creationist has to assemble the actants in the language of actor network theory, things like the rocks and so on, to make their case. And what is it that the creationist needs to find? The creationist needs to find bunny rabbit fossils at the lowest level of the fossil layer, and sadly the rocks never cooperate in that particular case. And I think we often forget with Latour, when we read something like Irreductions, is that he doesn't say that nothing is reducible to anything else. He says nothing is either reducible or irreducible to anything else. And so we can still take this project of critique and engage in that project of critique. We just have to show the networks, trace the networks, and find ways to undermine, as it were, those networks. So until you undermine the social network, for example, that makes the king will remain the king within that social formation. And so he potentially has those resources there in a way that sometimes he hasn't been given credit for, I would say, with somebody like Ray Brassier, who sees them in very uncharitable terms, I think, that are unfair. Catherine, did you have a point, or?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw a hand.
No.
But Pardon?
I've got something, Libby.
Yes. And
Yeah.
you are
Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, what about the argument that I guess I'm a little more promiscuous in your words in my delineation of objects, but that the objecthood actually allows critique. That when we don't allow something objecthood or some kind of delineation, that it's easier for it to slip away from critique. So, for example, if we don't allow some kind of object that exists, as somebody saying the king is the king because of the king's essence, then it's that the objecthood of that thought gives it some ground for critique that we can then we can see that it's then in the words of, I think in Jordan's word, it's a very weak, system, or it's a weak type of object. Does that make any sense?
And I mean, I would share that view. Why are we critiquing anything at all if it doesn't exist, if it isn't something real, as it were, out there in the social world? Back in the early days of...
it gives us more of a foothold, actually, to launch a critique.
Right. And I mean, it's just also a necessary condition. In certain ways, I think that this is what the Marxist-inspired materialists were talking about, right? We have these two distinct senses of the term materialism. On the one hand, when we talk about materialism, we have in mind something like Lucretius or Democritus, where everything can be reduced to physical material objects, such as, in that account, impenetrable, indivisible atoms and their combinations. And so that's one form of materialism. Everything is physical. But in the Marxist sense, I think, especially the way it evolved over time,
Right.
and Foucault as well, materialism came to mean something like actually existing practices rather than ideas in the head of somebody like Hegel or Kant. and the discourses and narratives surrounding those sorts of practices. And their thesis would have been the reason that probably they call themselves materialists, and why many people working in this tradition call themselves materialists, is because these are real things. They're embodied in institutions. If you take Foucault's account, the way in which our body undergoes disciplining is something that's written into habits in the very fabric of our body. We're finding that now, and this might be a controversial statement, but we're finding now that there seems to be strong indication that women that undergo severe environmental trauma during their period of pregnancy pass on in the actual genetics of the child, right, dispositions towards things such as anxiety disorders and that there might even be cognitive issues as well, that these things affect the very flesh of our bodies. And so those are very real things.
Yeah. So can we say those are objects of thought, I think is what we're pointing to. And I would even talk about relational objects, like objects of relation as well, because those are important. If we can't examine those from an object perspective, then, do they slip away as well if we don't allow them? It's an open question. I'm not a pro.
August and I, years ago in the early days of object-oriented ontology, Harman didn't share this position, but August and I caused a huge controversy that was very ugly and went on for weeks, if not maybe an entire year, making the claim that fictions are real. And that they have a material reality that circulates throughout the world. It's the Twilight Saga is there in the minds of thousands of teenagers, influencing how they think about relationships, and maybe even playing a key role in the Christian right and thinking about sort of alternative sexuality, the one that involves real physical contact, or something sublimated sexuality, right? These are sort of real things, and for some reason the confusion seemed to be, or what made this controversial, was the sense that this was saying somehow that there really is, these vampires out there walking around the world as living, breathing being, and certainly I don't think anybody was making that sort of claim. I think the claim was that ideas have a real presence in the world, and they do things, right? The question is, I think that there are some ontological assumptions in what you're saying, though, that I'm not necessarily hostile to. They're things that I'm struggling with myself, is that those kinds of beings, right, nonetheless have some sort of they're dependent in order to exist. They require a social network of some sort. They require minds in order to exist. If minds and societies were taken out of the picture, these things would exist. And so we'll get to that point and why it's important in a moment, because there are some claims that object-oriented philosophy made that I'm not sure are very sustainable, right? At the end of the day, we might need, with a variety of different entities, a far more, for lack of a better term, relationist ontology, right? In that connection, one of my favorite examples, I don't know if any of you have seen it, not a particularly good film, but back in the 80s, The Gods Must Be Crazy, right? And at the end of the film, the white man gives the tribal African man who's been disconnected from modern society and so on, he gives him a big wad of cash. Right, and as the man is walking to go back to his tribe, you see that he's just dropped this money and it's fluttering around on the ground. Right, it's not money for him.
Right.
It has no meaning as money because it doesn't have the network, the set of relationships that give something like that that value. And so when we talk about something like Graham Harman's philosophy, and if we were looking at Harman versus Latour in certain ways, we have to ask ourselves, can Harman account for something like that reality of money being dependent on a network? Harman wants to say, right, that that money has a real essence that, and this is the key point, that's independent of all relations. And in this book, I talk that way somewhat. I'm not sure if it's a sustainable thesis, but it seems very difficult to say that money can have being as money independent of that network that sustains it in its existence, right?
I would agree with that, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's what the issue is here. And, I mean, this brings us to the second point. You know, when we talk about object-oriented philosophy, right, we have the whole problem of essentialism, right? And, you know, so one of the most powerful things that critical theory has been able to accomplish is the critique of the idea of natural essences belonging to gender and race, and we could add nationality and so on, showing that that these identities, that these forms of existence are socially constructed in some way or another. And you know, the reason that that's so powerful, right, is, you know, how does essentialism function politically? Well, if people have these essences, we say of women, for example, or of, you know, people of certain ethnicities, well, you know, they are just essentially this way, and because they are essentially this way, you know, women shouldn't be going into the workforce. Instead, they should be staying home and taking care of children, because that's really what they want anyway. This is how they're put together, and if they went into the workforce, they wouldn't be able to do it because they just don't have the constitution physically, naturally, in order to be able to do those sorts of things. And, you know, these social constructivisms did a tremendous job undermining ideas like that, calling into question ideas like that, showing how these identities are formations of power, history, culture, and certain settings. And of course, when something like that is demonstrated or shown, then it becomes possible to call into question those social assemblages and whether or not they are legitimate, and envision the possibility of new social assemblages. And so I think that this is really, this essentialism here is really ground zero in the realism debate. The reason that so many of us itch when the term, or I itch anyway, when the term realism is evoked, is that is that we worry about a return of these sorts of essentialisms and the political power that accompanies them. And so, you know, when we read somebody like Harman say that there is an essence of the Egyptian people, it's just withdrawn, we can never fully know it, you know, I think in my mind, boy, that is a very dangerous claim to make, to say that there's an essence of the German people or of the French people or of the Egyptian people. And even if we make the claim that essence is withdrawn, I'm not sure that that really solves the problem, because if we go to something like Zizek's critique of ideology and the sublime object of ideology, he shows that, right, you know, the anti-Semite says, oh, there's an essence of the Jewish people, it's just withdrawn, we can never know it, there's just something, right, elusively different about this group of people, and that's why we should be doing what we're doing as anti-Semites. And, you know, I think we should be worried about this this talk of essences. And so, you know, we might have a question here where it's worth asking, well, when are there in fact any essences? It seems very difficult to me not to make the claim that there are some essences. I think that there must be an essence of iron, right? But maybe not. I'm not so sure. But when it comes to human social formations, right, it seems like there might be a lot of worries here that that arise with this realist talk of essences. And so one of the questions here, for me at least, and perhaps some of you disagree, would be that of, you know, how we can balance these accomplishments of critical theory and its variants and the politics that became possible out of that with some sort of robust realism as well. Right, this sort of project, which I'm trying to do in the Democracy of Objects, of squaring the circle and putting these two things together. Do we have any comments at this point or remarks?
I think the question here is whether practices are an object, like material practices. Are they an object or are they just constituting other objects? So are they only constructive in their relation to objects, or are practices themselves object?
Right. Any other thoughts here in response to what Bogna, the question Bogna just raised, or?
No, this is more going back to your previous concept about the essence of the Egyptian people. Just playing the devil's advocate here, but let's say you find someone lands on an ontology that just rings true and seems to be excellent, and it disagrees with your political concerns. The way that you're describing it, and I give you more credit than this, but the way you're describing it sounds like you're saying certain kinds of answers aren't permissible on the grounds of the kinds of political implications they might entail, which seems like a really odd requirement for an ontology.
Oh yeah, I mean I would agree with that, and I've spent a great deal of time arguing against this kind of normative commitments pushing what exists and what doesn't exist. And so, I've given these charged examples, and I give those examples. I mean, certainly, I agree. I reject or I disagree with the consequences that follow from those sorts of instances, but I also think that these things are just false, right? And that part of the reason for rejecting them is because they're not true, right? That there is nothing in the king that makes him the king. It's the king's relations to its subjects, and that recognizing this, that there's a network that makes the king a king, also brings about the possibility of calling into question that form of governance in that sort of instance. And so while if we talk about the case of anti-Semitism, certainly the ideology of a Jewish conspiracy is a real thing out there in the world, all too real, right? Persisting to our own day. But whether referentially it's true a Jewish conspiracy exists, right? I think that we need perhaps that space of reference in these discussions. Is there really a referent for that materially existing ideology, right? Or if we want to talk in the domain of the queer, right? And think about heteronormativity, right? Certainly heteronormativity is an actually existing real set of social assumptions that pervade our society, but as a theory of people's bodies and so on, is there a real referent that that corresponds to? And it's a difficult question, right? These sorts of things. Other thoughts here? Other comments?
One interesting thought I had rereading the first couple chapters of your book was how Heidegger's historicism, with correlationism and the fact that you have sort of being reduced to modes of access to being, and for Heidegger this entails a sort of historicism in terms of you have this history of modes of access, but how then with an object-oriented ontology you could potentially have a different sort of historicism, which is a history of actually existing objects, how they're composed, how a collective object is composed, and how you can even think of things like, say, philosophy itself as potentially being a sort of collective object with its own history, for example. And thinking in terms of like collective objects, things that have a history to them, which are composed in various ways and that change over time. I wonder, if we don't have to pay attention to like, well, what are the histories of these objects we're dealing with? And for example, science would seem to be a major reference point, thinking of science as like a collective object with a history that's composed of, many complex parts, both material and ideological and so on. And, I think Democracy of Objects, if I'm not mistaken, was written a little bit before you took sort of a commitment to naturalism. At least that's what I remember from your blog. But anyways.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it depends on what naturalism and materialism mean.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
So, I mean, if it means that science is the master discourse, no, I'm not a materialist or a naturalist in this sense. If it means that all entities have some sort of physical reality, right, that exists in the world, I guess I would describe myself as a materialist or a naturalist because I'm a Deleuzian, right? So I'm not a materialist or a naturalist in the sense that somebody like Paul and Patricia Churchland might be these things, or that Scott Baker might be these things. I believe that we're headed at this plane of imminence.
I wouldn't put science in like the position of the master either, but at the same time, I think that if we look realistically at our world now, science occupies a very important position in that world, and if we critique it as a sort of collective object with a history that is in our world that does a lot to determine things about that world and gives us knowledge about that world that's very important. On the one hand, you can see that philosophy is going to, as its own collective project, is going to have to relate to this in one form or another, right?
Yes,
it can use aspects of science to, for example, help provide, say, a dividing line between real objects and things like the essence of the German people. Right. On the other hand, you also have to, you want to retain that critique so you can apply it to science, in the way that some is done in science studies in order to understand the way science itself is embedded in larger social structures, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a good time to segue into this whole issue of, well, given these sort of noxious things that have arisen from certain, previous realisms in the past, and I always give the example of the Great Chain of Being during the Middle Ages. Why would we want a realism at all? Right? Perhaps we would just want to go the full route of social constructivism because it's done so much work for us. And I think the flip side of this issue is, and I think you're alluding to this, is we have issues like climate change, right? And we want to be able to say these aren't just social constructions, or they may be socially constructed in a very profound sense that we're living in the Anthropocene and we produce these things. But this is something that's really happening, that evolution isn't just one optional theory that somebody can take up a position for or against, but that evolution describes a real reality out there in the world. And if we talk about something like the Iraq War, right, there was a truth or falsity about whether or not they had weapons of mass destruction and these sorts of things. And so it seems like we need something that allows us to navigate these sorts of debates. And it might be that in especially French-inflected postmodern and post-structuralist thought, we went so far over in the direction of the linguistic turn and social constructivism that we kind of cut out the ground beneath ourselves in being able to talk about these sorts of things. And perhaps, as you're putting it, philosophy might help us, right, to raise some of these questions and to navigate how is it pronounced, the Charybdis and Scylla, is that the way it's pronounced? My pronunciation is horrible. Right, you know, these two twin perils. Right, and so, you know, I think we have a couple of questions here that you know, we have one question that's been raised is just what is an object? Right? Does everything count as an object? Right? Or are there some things that are pseudo-objects that aren't really objects? And we have the nice, very nuanced position of was it that argued this position, that said they were much more promiscuous than I am. Maybe they left the classroom. Right? That even these things that are social constructions, nonetheless, are objects in some very real or fundamental sense because they're sustained by a network. And we also have, I think, the rather odd or unusual question, when is an object? When is an object? Right? And when I pose that question, when is an object, you know, the sort of question I'm raising there is, are there certain generative and network conditions that need to be met in order for an object to come into being and sustain itself as an entity, right? And so, you know, just some basic vocabulary, which many of you might be familiar with. If I'm belaboring points that you're long familiar with, let me know. But, right, when we talk about object-oriented ontology, or OO, I think there's been a lot of confusion surrounding this term, and this might be like some sort of insider-type distinction that irritates the hell out of people on the outside. Right? But when we talk about OO, object-oriented ontology, we're talking about any position that contends that the universe is, or being, or existence is composed of units. Any position, right? And so this is a term like empiricism, and among the empiricists, right, you have Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and they disagree with each other. They have different philosophies. Or it's a position like rationalism, where you have Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, who have very different ontologies, but somehow loosely fall under this term rationalism. Well, when we talk about object-oriented ontology, any philosophy that claims that being is composed of units counts as an object-oriented ontology. And so examples of object-oriented ontologists would be Aristotle with his substances, Leibniz with his monads, somebody near and dear to my heart, I go back and forth about this, would Spinoza count as an object-oriented ontologist? Right, he says there's one substance, but he also has all those bodies moving about within this huge plane of eminence that he outlines. Whitehead would be an example of an object-oriented ontologist. Jane Bennett, Karen Barad, as well as perhaps myself and Graham Harman. All of these positions fall under this umbrella, and we see that there's a great disagreement and diversity among these positions. It doesn't refer to any one thing, beyond the claim that there are some sort of units that's shared among these positions. And of course, many of the people that I'm grouping here would vehemently object to this characterization of their thought. And then on the other hand, we have OOP, right? And so this is going to be Harman's specific position, right? And when we talk about, and so if we talk about Harman's specific position, right, we have a number of claims that are specific to his ontology. Am I belaboring points that you're all familiar with, or is this good stuff?
Good stuff.
Catherine thinks it's good stuff. Okay. Well, if Catherine says so, it must be good stuff, right? Right. And so when we talk about OOP, right, Harman's position or Harman's claims, he makes the claim that all objects are withdrawn from all relations. Right, so he describes these entities as how does he put it? He says they're vacuum sealed. Right, they're always behind. He says firewalls, and so there's a very real sense in which, for Harman, objects, entities, never touch one another. Right, they are just completely withdrawn from each other. They never touch one another. And so, you know, when people hear this thesis, and we can raise the question of whether or not it's fair to Harman or not, when people hear this thesis, there's the question, well, how are we to take account of dependencies among objects and relationships between objects? I mean, I feel, and so there's, and it's also, there's a very real sense in which Harman is a true Leibnizian in his own very strange way. For those of you who are familiar with Leibniz's monadology, it's this philosophy. You know, right now, our sort of default position, I think that we all share in common, is that there's some sort of causal interaction between all of us here in this room, virtually here in this room, and that something is coming into us from the outside that that wasn't inside of us before. So somehow we're causally impacting one another. But if you look at what Leibniz says, no, it's not that way at all. Every monad, every entity that exists already contains everything that will ever happen to it, past, present, and future. And so even if God in Leibniz's universe got really angry and smited me out of existence, just, you know, got out his giant divine eraser and erased me, all of you would hear the remainder of this lecture. According to Leibniz, you would hear the next 3 lectures, even though I don't exist, because it's not me that's somehow causally impacting you, right? It's already just like a VCR or a cassette tape, for those of us who remember cassette tapes and VCR tapes. It's already there, inscribed inside of us. It just has to unfold. And so Harman, of course, is not a Leibnizian in that sense, but he is a Leibnizian in the sense that he doesn't think any of these objects ever relate to one another and touch each other. This is what he seems to mean when he claims that that objects are withdrawn. It's not just that they have an inscrutable essence; they really, genuinely don't touch each other, even at points, even partially, according to him. And he's been quite insistent on this sort of point. And so, you know, the question here is, if that's true, how are we to understand things like trees, right? You know, a tree is certainly, it needs temperatures to be within a certain range of heat and coldness. If it gets too hot, they're incinerated, they burn up. If it's too cold, right, they perhaps shatter and fall apart. It needs oxygen, it needs light, it needs soil. There is a degree of gravity that they probably need. If the mass of the planet Earth were much greater, right, they wouldn't be able to grow up into the sky in the way they do. They would be pulled to the ground and crushed. There are all sorts of ways in which trees do seem to very deeply relate to one another and depend on one another to exist as they do. And so the question then is, to what degree is this withdrawal thesis, confronted with these sorts of features of reality, a defensible thesis? And so do we have any thoughts here or remarks? Or are we all just stunned at this point? Why is he talking about trees? Yes. You can. You're on mute, Jesse, I think. Still on mute. Oh no. Okay, well, hopefully we'll figure that out, and you can get back to us. Now, you know, I think one of the valuable points that that Harman is making, and it's a very subtle point, and you know, we've had not just me and Harman, but in the ugly blogosphere, we've had debates for years over this issue of relationism. Right, and so, you know, we have these two polar extremes. We have Harman's position that objects are vacuum sealed and independent of one another, that they only ever touch through sensuous vicars, as he puts it. And there might be a more generous way of interpreting Harman on these points. And on the other hand, we have the relationists that you know, claim that all relations are internal to everything in the entire universe, is related to everything else, and is what it is by virtue, right, of how it internalizes these relations. And so this would be the sort of object-oriented ontological position of Alfred North Whitehead, right? Whitehead says every entity shares a determinate relation to everything else that exists in the universe. Well, right, we have these two extreme positions, and we might be able to think of a more moderate position, if that's an admirable thing in the world of theory and philosophy, where we can talk about relations being severed, right? And so entities can depend on relations in a variety of ways, but they can also break relations with other entities in all sorts of ways. And, you know, as I've spent a great deal of time arguing, this is actually, contrary to what it might think that it's doing, this is actually what ecological thought is in fact doing. Ecological thought, you know, begins kind of as its official ideology with the position that everything is related to everything else and dependent on everything else, and that's a nice vision. But if we look at concrete nuts and bolts ecological criticism and analysis, right, what do we see that we're actually doing? We're looking at those sets of dependencies that, for example, bees require in order to exist, and we're looking at situations in which, because of changes, new chemicals being introduced into the environment, or you know, certain features being taken out of a coral reef ecosystem and so on, where relations have been severed that lead to a collapse of portions of that ecosystem. And so, what we have here in this sort of orientation is a recognition of the importance of relations, right, while also recognizing their fragility and how easily they can be broken. Objects do in fact touch, but they're not constituted by their relations. And an additional cash value of this, if we want to put it in those sorts of terms, oh Lord, somebody's going to accuse me of neoliberalism now for using that pragmatist term, right? But an initial payoff of this would be that when we think about what's going on in political engagement, the whole point of political engagement is to destroy or sever relations. If all relations were internal, it's very difficult to see how we could ever break with a particular social network. And so we might have this position of the fragility of relations. So any comments or remarks here? Jesse, did you get your screen working, or?
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. I was trying to fix it, so I kind of wasn't listening to the last minute of what was being said.
Okay.
I was half listening, I'm sorry. But I was going to, I don't know if this is kind of going in a different direction, but I was going to comment on the question that you had about when is an object. Because when you started in the first kind of part of the conversation talking about, essentialism and, eventually this idea of correlationism, for me, thinking about how objects, I guess, come to be, it always considers is revolving around a question of time as well. Mm-hmm. And so for me, one of the, I guess, things where people get stuck, and I work in education, and so critical theory is really big there, and I've always found that we get stuck in these conversations where everything is always already known, and so objects, bodies, beings already have these definitions that are predetermined, and so for me, the idea of correlationism limits in that way in terms of this temporal kind of becoming sense of the word. And so for me, thinking about more object-oriented ontologies, I think it's been helpful for thinking about the idea of becoming and maybe something that will be actualized and therefore defined, by its networks and those kinds of things. So that's a bunch of words rambled together. I don't know if there's any comments. Wait. Oh goodness! Right. And now my computer over there just turned on. Okay. So yeah, that's.
All right. So let's hold off on Jesse's remarks for a moment and take about 5 or 10 minutes to get coffee or use the restroom or get vodka or smoke a cigarette, whatever your poison of choice is, and we'll meet back here at 8:26 your time. Is that all right?
Yep.
Okay. We'll see you in a few.
let or denied me.
All right, so if people want to begin wandering back in. Is everyone, it looks like everyone's returned. And so hopefully everyone had a nice break. Do we have any comments or remarks to begin the second half of the seminar?
Yeah.
Yes. Jeff.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you said about harm and withdrawal, and I'm puzzled by this example he uses a lot of cotton and fire, where he talks about that the relation between cotton and fire, when they come together, when there's burning cotton,
right,
it's two qualities that are relating to each other or having an effect on each other. It's the heat of the fire, and I think he says the flammability of the cotton that are coming together, but fire and cotton are still withdrawn. Right. I mean, I look at the phenomenon and I say, well, there's a third thing. There's burning cotton, then there's ash and smoke, and then where did the cotton come from? Well, there was a seed, soil, sunlight, water. So he seems to be sort of wanting to, or the implications he put it before, some kind of essence that's behind the what we can touch or the object quality of these things. How do you understand that example? And I'm not sure it makes much sense to me, but
Well, it's interesting. For those of you who might be reading Peter Grattan's recent book on speculative realism, he contends, and this will upset Jesse, he contends that for Harman, objects aren't in time at all. Right? Time is just a kind of sensuous surface of entities that, in and of themselves, are timeless. And for me, of course, my objects are processes. They're pulsating activities that, from moment to moment, have to be reproducing themselves and engaging in operations to continue existing. We'll get to that later on when we get to the interior of objects. But I think that there's a charitable way of interpreting what Harman is trying to say. There's like two texts inside of Harman that I see, and so one is the sort of explicit text, right, where he's saying these things. Well, nothing ever touches, right? The fire never really encounters the cotton, and I think this is a sort of perhaps, and he would probably find this language objectionable. I think this is a kind of poetic description of what it is that he's trying to describe. I think that what he's really attempting to describe in these sorts of things is that entities only ever partially encounter one another, and so for the fire, and I mean he's very insistent on this point, right? That they never touch in any way at all. But I mean, I think the point that he's trying to get across is for the fire, it's only encountering certain, in this case, chemical aspects of that cotton, and it would be missing other things in the cotton, such as its color or whatnot, right? We only have partial perspectives, and I think that if we give that sort of charitable reading of Harman, there's a lot to recommend itself about that position. One of the things that we're looking for in the sciences is how things interact selectively and so on, what produces what. But also when we engage in various forms of cultural analysis, we're looking at the filters by which certain groups encounter the world, how we can begin to enter into their worlds and how they encounter the world, and so on and so forth. We would get this new sort of radicalized phenomenology that isn't just phenomenology for how do I relate to the world around me as a human subject, but also different subject groups within humanity, right? Like Temple Grandin and how she encounters the world, the people in this class position and how they encounter the world, and so on and so forth. But also we could look at how animals encounter the world, how corporations encounter the world, and so on, and begin to analyze these sorts of things. But certainly he doesn't really describe it in that way. It's a very perplexing, I agree, example that he gives. Bogna, did you have a comment to make? Or was it Jordan?
Well, I was thinking about the same thing that Jeff brought up in the break. But I think in Harman, what puzzles me is that I don't really get whether he is for the distinction of qualities in objects, like primary qualities and secondary qualities. Mm-hmm. Is he saying that there's such a division? That's why he gives the example of fire and cotton, because fire burns cotton, but it can't know that cotton is white, as you said. Yeah. And I wonder how that relates to your own ontology. Like, do we have layers of qualities in objects, or are they just...
Well, I mean, for me, and I was hoping to get to this next, as we, segue into the discussion of the first chapter of the Democracy of Objects. For me, the operative distinction is between, on the one hand, powers or capacities, what something can do, and on the other hand, qualities. And so a power, it's very difficult to put into language. It's a potential of an object or an entity or a thing. It's something that that entity can do, and when the object acts in the appropriate way, then it produces qualities. It produces effects, and we'll talk a great deal about this in the sessions to come. So, a couple of points, returning to some comments that Jesse made about when is an object one of the things, and we'll talk about the becoming of objects later on, hopefully, but one of the things I wanted to get at with this question, when is an object, is that we seem to make a hard distinction between, on the one hand, nature, and on the other hand, culture. Right, and so it seems that when we talk about nature, right, or sort of a common sense way of talking about nature is that nature is the domain of, if I can still spell tonight. I'm so sorry to you guys too that I did not sleep at all last night. It was, yeah, a rough night. But we tend to talk about natural entities as being independent, right? It's when we talk about the roundness of the Earth or the spherical nature of the planet Earth as a natural entity, what we're saying is that regardless of what people say about the planet Earth, it is what it is. It's spherical, even if we say that it's flat or it's on the back of a tortoise or something like that. Regardless of whether or not anybody's thought about hydrogen atoms, right? They have the features that they have. What is it? One electron in the case of hydrogen. I'm showing my ignorance here. And so they're independent. They would be what they are, regardless of how we talk about them. And then when we talk about culture, and so this goes back to the whole discussion we were having that Jordan, I think it was, so nicely, or maybe it was it Jeff, so nicely criticized. All right, we tend to think of culture as a domain sort of fictions because things like money and the king and so on and so forth are dependent, right? They only are what they are for that social network, and I think that when we begin to really think about nature and what we've learned about the natural world out there, that this distinction is far less hard and fast than we might immediately think. And our tendency as well here is to think of, right, the independent. We say, okay, this is what's real. And so we can say that the modernist project was all about trying to separate out what's real, what is genuinely natural and existing in its own right. It's independent of discourse and people's beliefs and ideas. And on the other hand, when we talk about culture, right, we want to say that it is constructed, and when we say that it's constructed, the implication is, the whiff is always that because these beings are dependent, they're somehow a domain of fictions. They lack reality in some way. I mean, do you think that that's a fair characterization of what's going on with modernity, or? Don't leave me hanging.
It's a fair characterization of the typical discourse of it. I don't know if that's a fair characterization of modernity.
Right. Okay.
I do want to link this, and you can expand on this later. This to the previous discussion about when is an object, yes, with Tim Morton's realist magic, which took a very physics-grounded approach where he talked about how both space and time are second-order effects of objects. In other words, objects were primary and objects space and time, and he was drawing very heavily off of what we know from general relativity, which I think helps when you talk about four-dimensional space-time objects, and people's intuition tend to be objects. The word object in our language tends to imply something more static and unchanging, but the reality of it is that all of these things are time dependent, and then for me the much more interesting question is not so much when is an object, is how do you bound an object? How do you talk about discrete phenomena when reality doesn't seem to be discrete?
Well, what do you mean when you say that reality isn't discrete?
Well, it doesn't seem to be discrete. Like, I feel like when we talk about objects, we're kind of like a computer that is quantizing. So if you're familiar with digital audio, right? CD-ROMs, it's all encoded zeros and ones, and what it's doing is it's doing a sampling rate where it says, you know, every second I'm taking so many samples, and each sample is represented by so many zeros and ones, and anything that happens faster than that sampling rate is simply lost. For the CD-ROM, it doesn't exist, you know, but sound has a higher resolution than that in terms of natural sound that we record, and so we know that in our case, we actually know that we're losing that information, but as far as the digital sound recorder is concerned, that doesn't exist. And I feel like, you know, when we talk about objects, we're kind of doing that sort of lossy grasp of reality where we're recognizing our own conceptual limitations of what we're able to articulate, and so we say, all right, you know, this is a good enough depiction of reality. It's not an accurate depiction of reality because we're throwing away all kinds of things, and we're arbitrarily chopping reality up into these parsable bits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's something we definitely want to avoid, right? We want to distinguish between the description of an entity and the entity itself, and allow for the fact that there's some sort of gap, right, between these two things that escapes that description. A description is always going to be selective, right? It's always going to be a translation of another entity, and so there's always going to be a way in which it is reductive, I guess, and so that would be, you know, in part a defense of Harman's thesis about withdrawal. I thought you were going to move more in the direction of quantum mechanics, right, and make an argument along the lines of non-locality, that there's something about particles that can never be, you know, to use Whitehead's terminology, they can never be simply located in the universe. It defies simple location. It's both there and there. And you know, going back to the theme of trees again, you know, what are the boundaries of the tree? Because the tree really is, right, an interface with the world around it. And so where does the tree begin and where does the tree end? I mean, you brought up the issue of four-dimensional, right, space-time worms as being what objects are that you know, I've described in the past. And so part of it is I want to see, or I want to argue for some sort of historical lineage that defines the being of the object. And so if we're talking about Jordan, right, Jordan has gone through many different phases. Jordan as he exists right now is very different than Jordan as he existed when he was 3 years old or something like that. Right, but there's still some sort of continuity between these different Jordans. And on the other hand, I want to suggest that perhaps there's something like a plastic pattern, right, that can undergo variations, but something of that pattern is retained in the evolution of the entity that makes it what it is. And so I don't know if that addresses those sorts of concerns or not. But the sort of point that I wanted to make here about modernity and you know, about Jesse is that it seems as if the entities of nature are a lot more like the entities of culture than we might suspect. We want to say something like, I must be obsessed with money right now because I have no money in my bank account. But we want to say something like money isn't real or doesn't have reality because, you know, if you give that money to the you know, the person that is outside of you know, capitalist economy, right? They don't see any value. It's dependent on a certain system in order to have that value. But there's a difference in degree here between money requiring a certain set of dependencies in order to exist as money, and the tree requiring a certain ecosystem and set of physical conditions in order to exist. And this should call into question, I think, the sort of reality-unreality distinction that we talk about. The tree requires a whole set of ecological conditions in order to exist, in order to sustain itself, just as something like a king requires a certain set of conditions. And so perhaps this characterization of nature as being defined in terms of independent being, right, is a pretty crude characterization of how it is with nature. Perhaps we should instead argue that there's something like ecosystems all the way down and all the way up as well, and that when we talk about a society, what we're talking about is not something that is, or a culture, we're talking about something not that is distinct from nature, but a particular sort of ecosystem within the natural world. So any thoughts there? Or?
Well, my wife is an ecologist, and one of the really hard things about ecology is sort of figuring out, well, what object is tangled up with what other objects, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not inherently obvious when you look at a particular system. You know, you have bluebirds, for example. What are the bluebirds affecting, and what is affecting the bluebirds? And you want to figure out what those things are, and so you come up with experimental methods, and you apply those, and you find out, for example, that, you know, bluebirds aren't eating spiders. And this has all sorts of implications for a particular system, you know, because spiders are predators of insects, and bluebirds are also predators of insects. And so if they had eaten spiders, that would mean something very different for, say, the impact of bluebirds on a wine vineyard than it would mean if they did eat spiders. And you know, it's a tricky thing, but you know, it's always us trying to pull out, well, this affects this and doesn't affect that, and you know, this means these things. You know, like you could apply the same sort of thing to like politics. You know, like, well, you know, class is interacting with gender in this particular way in this particular time, and that means this for how you know, try to go about accomplishing some political goal.
Well, and sometimes you have no idea what a given, you know, you'll omit something from your description of the ecology of the environment until it's gone. I was talking with someone last night about the effect of parasite removal projects in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and how that seems to be linked, and they're still doing research on this, to corresponding rise in autoimmune disease risk for those populations that, you know, got rid of tapeworm, got rid of whipworm, got rid of some of these things that we considered parasites. And you know, parasitism was always considered kind of a one-sided relationship. You know, the parasite was leeching off of the host, and the host was deriving no benefit and was actually, you know, being harmed. But now people are realizing that, okay, yeah, the harm was real, and it was a lopsided relationship, but there was other things going on that only by the removal of it from the environment, and you started seeing that environment go into a dysfunctional state, that you start saying, oh, there's more going on here.
Right.
Yeah.
And it also changes the actual being of the entities that are interacting. I mean, like if you take out bluebirds out of a system, you know, how does that affect the evolution of the insect populations? So I mean, the insects themselves, you know, their populations will change their genetic makeup, you know, based on whether you have certain predators present or not, you know. So I don't know, it's
well, I mean, these are exactly the sort of questions that that interest me. You know, what are the causal relationships? What are the dependencies within entities? That's what I mean by a regime of attraction, which we'll talk about, you know, later on in the semester. And so, you know, it's not a question of fetishistically, you know, focusing on these discrete individual objects detached from the world, but exactly, you know, something like what your wife is doing. What is the causation here? Now, for me, it happens to be particularly in the domain of social and political theory that I'm interested in. I mean, to take a very vulgar, probably unfair example, you know, we can think of the issue of climate change, and you know, somebody might think, an activist might think, oh, you know, the problem is people don't really believe in climate change, and that's why they're not doing anything. And so then that suggests a certain practice, right? If that's your theory as to why action isn't being taken here, your idea is going to be to get out there in the world and demonstrate to people that, in fact, the theory of anthropomorphic climate change is true, that it's really taking place. It would be an engagement with a certain rhetoric. And certainly that can't hurt. Certainly that's going to be part of the issue. But it could be, in a manner similar to what you're describing with ecology, it could be something that people don't have public transportation available to them. They don't have an option. And so they believe that climate change is taking place, right? But they exist in what I call a regime of attraction, a certain, network of actants and entities that requires them, in order to live and sustain themselves, to engage in certain practices that in their ideal world they wouldn't otherwise engage in. And if that's the case, right, this suggested very different practice. It wouldn't so much be about persuading people that climate change is really taking place. It would be instead about struggling to find new forms of transportation and public transportation that would alleviate those people. And I don't want to suggest, right, because some people say, oh gosh, you're proposing a sort of technological determinism. It's much more complex than that, right? We have fields of science, of narratives and ideologies, but they're also, just like in any ecology, they're also intertwined with these physical actants. And so one of our political strategies can be quite literally a design strategy that changes built features of the physical environment, affording people new possibilities that aren't there before, and that don't even require people to have these sorts of beliefs that something like climate change is, in fact, human-caused, in order for the effects to be produced. We have this sort of fetishization of persuasion and people sharing beliefs as the only form of politics that we can engage in, and perhaps there are alternatives. I mean, and so, with this sort of pan-ecologism, sometimes I've even suggested that perhaps we should, and it just never works, perhaps we should abandon the term society altogether and instead talk about hominid ecologies or something like that. What I want to do here is I want to take certain features of nature and bring them into the cultural world as a part of our analysis of how power functions and how power structures human social relations. And so this could be disease epidemiologies, rates at which different kinds of grains grow, their yield, weather patterns, all sorts of things that, that play a role in why people relate to each other in the way they do. Not the only role, but they certainly play a role, I think. And I think we need to take those into account, and of course technologies as well, and how they affect us qua technologies and not simply the meanings that we attribute to them. But also I want to see in the domain of nature certain features that resemble features of culture. So we would think of culture as a specific ecology that opens onto the broader natural world, and it would include features that are included in a non-human ecological network, such as the one you're talking about that your wife studies. And those, in a lot of ways, they resemble a culture, don't they? I mean, would you agree with that, Dave? Or is it Dave? Yeah, Dave. David?
Dave, yeah. So, yeah, I agree with that. I mean... Right,
and so... we're thinking about a certain assemblage that in a lot of ways looks like a society. It's historically contingent. It has a history. There are all sorts of relations of dependency within that ecology of the starfish. And so in that regard, right, it resembles a culture, but on the other side of the equation, there are all sorts of features of human societies, of hominin societies, and of culture that open on to built features of the environment. And so, increasingly, for example, there's a body of research that suggests that all this use of antibiotics that we're engaged in, the soaps we're using to wash our hands and everything, that our bodies are quite literally assemblages. They're colonies of all sorts of different living organisms, and that these do things like regulate our nervous system and so on. And so when we talk about things like the spike in depression and anxiety disorders, it might not just be a sort of Lacanian explanation that we would want, right, that, you know, something is going on in the symbolic. There might also be this dimension that our body just doesn't have the necessary transmitters in it because we've killed it all from, you know, the hand soaps that we're using. I mean, that might be insane to suggest, but, you know, the point here is that we need to think, I think, in order to understand ourselves, about the role played by these non-human actants. So any remarks there?
Well, I actually wondered, when you're talking about these different processes in, you know, relative to the body, would you call those material processes?
Which processes are you talking about?
When you're talking about, you know, the rise in psychiatric diagnoses and the ways in which our bodies break down, and I'm just wondering if you are creating a type of, like, a relational or a reciprocity between nature and culture, are the processes that come out of that reciprocity, are those material processes?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, material is very broad. I mean, it can include everything from the sort of disciplinary regime that you go through when you go to Catholic school, right, and the way in which that forms your body, and the way in which gym class formed your body, and so on and so forth, and the diet that you had at the in the school cafeteria and stuff like that, to things like the role played by a river dividing two cities, or, you know, repeated disease epidemiology throughout a community, and so on and so forth. All of these things, I think, are material processes. And so, you know, the idea of an object, and, you know, there's a lot I regret about The Democracy of Objects. I still like the book in a lot of respects, but, you know, I don't think I express myself quite well on sort of other issues. The idea of an object is only a stepping stone to get to sort of what you're describing, this sort of reciprocity. And so, you know, a lot of what's going on in this first chapter, where I'm trying to make an argument as to why we can have a realist ontology, what merits realism, using Roy Basker, and why we need to say that that reality is composed of entities, is to get to that point of thinking about this reciprocity of relations. It's also unfolding one of the basic structures of objects as I understand them. And of course, you can use whatever signifier you like. You can say processes, you can say events. You know, the term doesn't matter. It's just, I need to be honest, you know, sometimes I have an imp of the perverse in me. Maybe I chose the term object just because it pisses people off, right? But, you know, because I'm irritating. But I mean, what we get when we look at, you know, Roy Basker's realist ontology is, on the one hand, we have the domain of what's called, what he calls generative mechanisms. A lot of people probably don't like the word mechanism, you know, it doesn't sound very romantic, and so on and so forth. But, you know, he says that in order for science to be possible, we have to presuppose the existence of these generative mechanisms that he calls intransitive to culture and mind. Right? This barbarous word that he uses, right? Intransitive. And all he means by intransitive is that they're there, they exist apart from us, they would be there whether or not we knew them. He's not making a claim that they are eternal and unchanging, right? They can very well become. He's just making the claim that they're not dependent on any sort of a cultural discourse. And the mark of these generative mechanisms, if we talk about what it is that composes these generative mechanisms. They're like sets or configurations of what he calls powers or capacities. And so, on the one hand, we have these entities that exist out there in the natural world, these generative mechanisms. And what's interesting about them is that they can be dormant, right? Or they can be interacting with other generative mechanisms. And by the way, these are my objects. They can be interacting with other objects or generative mechanisms in such a way that what they can do doesn't appear in the world. It's either they're laying there dormant, they're not acting at that particular time, just like a match can sit there on your countertop without being lit, right? It has the power to produce fire, but it's not producing fire at that point. Well, similarly, out there in nature, they can either be countervailed by some other entity, or they might not be acting at all. They can be covered up. And then the other half, and we'll talk about this in Chapter 2, with the paradox of substance, is events. Right? And so both of these things together, if we wanted to draw a little circle and put a line through it, one half of the entity is generative mechanisms, the other half is events. Right, this whole thing is what an object is. And with Astor, he thinks that the aim or what science does is it tries to create artificial environments where you can isolate these generative mechanisms, and then you can kind of like poke them with a stick. Right? You see, oh, well, when I poke it with a stick, when I heat it up in this way, or when I subject it to this sort of pressure, or I mix it with this substance, an event happens. Right? And we begin to discover, well, what are the powers or the capacities that this entity, this substance, this thing, this generative mechanism is capable of? Is that, so far, does that make sense? Were you, okay. All right, and so, we have one face of the object, the powers, the potentials, the capacities that it has. We have the other side of the object, what it does at certain points, the events that it produces, and then we have a third dimension, experiences that we have through observing these things. They're all distinct from one another. And, it's, Dave puts it quite nicely, right, when he says that entities out there in the environment, they can behave differently depending on, right, the way in which they interact with other things and other substances. And so that's part of what the ecologist is doing, right? What happens, right, when these two things interact with one another? What new events are produced, or in my language, what new qualities emerge out of that, that interaction? And so this is what I mean in distinction to somebody like Harman, when I say objects are withdrawn. They have this reservoir of potentiality, of power, of capacity, right, that we can never quite, that we never quite fully know, because entities have to be put into relations with one another, ecologies with one another, to see what happens and what's produced. Catherine, did you have a remark? Or?
No, just it's starting to make sense when you're talking about the open systems, closed systems, and then where I was getting stuck before is the idea of like participation within those systems, like what things fall in. The science experiment is a really obvious open, closed system. Mm-hmm. So then where do other things fall, in terms of that?
And there's danger, right? Because, and I don't think Baxter does a good job talking about this. There's a danger in the closed system of the scientific experiment, because you're triggering these objects or generative mechanisms in very specific ways. If we think about DDT, right, with the pesticide back in, what was it, the 70s or early 80s, that killed off all these bird populations. Well, in the lab, it behaved under these specific conditions in very specific ways. You get it out there in nature where it is entering into an ecology or a set of relations with other entities, and suddenly it's doing something that's quite unexpected, right? And you know, at the risk of sounding, you know, trendy or something like that, we really need not only an ethics of open systems, a sort of caution with respect to the entities, the substances that we release out into the world, because who knows what events they're going to produce when they interact with other things, such as these antibacterial soaps, if in fact something like that is going on with antibacterial soaps and people are suffering from depression and anxiety as a result of not having the right ecology in their digestive system. People are really making this claim. But we also need to be more cognizant and engage more in investigating, right, the variability of the events that entities produce as they interrelate with other entities, I think. Because we have a tendency, you know, we can say that this side of the event, right, that this is the, and this is the way I'll argue it as we proceed, this is the actual, you know, when an event takes place, something has become actual. My body is a generative mechanism. When I'm out there too long in the sun, you know, I get tan or I get burnt. Something has been actualized through this interaction of my body in sunlight, this generative mechanism. On the other hand, this is the virtual, which just means potential. And when we talk about objects, we have a tendency to just reduce them to this dimension of the actual, not being aware that they are, that at least in my view, they contain a reservoir of potentials, powers, and possibilities that might be quite unexpected if we just change the relationships.
An interesting example of that in a systems context that's really explicit also from, you know, what do we do about it, is the Knight Capital situation with high frequency trading algorithms on the stock market, where they were losing, I think they lost, you know, millions of dollars a second or something like that. It was insane. It was like they lost $10 billion, I think, over the course of 10 or 15 minutes. And it was a situation where, you know, kind of like DDT, they put this algorithm out into the wild of the stock trade market, but you can't predict how is it going to work in this ecosystem of all these other algorithms that are all trying to do things. And if you just hit that right combination of things where you start making a perverse decision that it seems sane to sell, or buy, and the reason that was so illustrative is it was happening on a time scale. You know, the problem with an ecosystem, like if you're studying, you know, bluebird populations or something like that, or DDT, is your time scales are often years, decades, centuries before you could really start seeing that, hey, this causal thing happened. Whereas, you know, with the software, it was happening so fast that it was actually happening faster than people could stop it. But it gives a really good example of, you know, and the problem is then of course people say, well, we want to regulate it, we want to know in advance that that's not going to happen. It's like, it's an open system. You have no guarantees that that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Although I do think you know, regulation is itself a generative mechanism that can have unintended consequences. It's a kind of object for me, I guess.
Well, and that's the other thing.
Something like that, right? I mean,
with the regulation, Charles Perrow wrote a book called Normal Accidents, and he does a diagnosis of accidents in nuclear power plants, and the majority of them actually occur due to safety devices.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because when you're adding something to a complex system, you're actually exponentially increasing the number of relations that system has, which as a side effect means that you're increasing the possible failure space.
Yeah. Other comments, remarks?
I'm having some trouble with something, but I'm not really sure where it comes in. Just like when you're talking about you're trying to, I guess, identify objects or look at things as enclosed entities. Like, even if you just take, you know, an object that we all know, it's that fuzzy boundaries, you know. It's like where does I guess with some objects it's really obvious, and then with other objects it's not. So when we're talking about, when we get into that problem of open systems, I'm just wondering if there are ways without totally closing down the system, because you can only do that under certain conditions. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to, I don't know, some intermediary between a closed system and a totally open system, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm very cautious about this in saying that, you know, I think being is composed of generative mechanisms, while also saying I'm not sure what they are, right? You know, I think it's very much an empirical question that requires experimentalism. It's not something that can be known in advance. And it gets quite complicated, right? You know, I think later on in the book, or that might be ontocartography, I can't remember, or it might be an article. You know, I talk about Justice Scalia, you know, the Supreme Court justice, and I mean, on the one hand, there's the person. Obviously, I think as a person, we can pretty safely say that he is a generative mechanism, that he exists in his own right. And then there's the office of him as a judge. And the question is, well, this office of him as a judge, is that an independent object, or is it a quality or an element of a larger scale entity or object, such as the justice system in the United States? Is it something that exists independently in its own right, or is it, you know, is Justice Scalia's body and brain and mind something that this larger scale system of the legal system uses as an element to produce itself, that doesn't have independent existence apart from itself? And so the questions, you know, the relations can become, I think, quite hairy very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. When we think about this. You know, I think that myself as a professor at my college, there's a difference between me as an individual person in that system and as somebody that occupies a role in this institution that is being deployed in specific ways. And we'll talk about this a bit when we get to questions of mereology and the interior of objects. Yeah. Other remarks?
I thought about objects transforming into one another. For example, money. Actually, 70% of money is cotton. So first we have the cotton plant, and then the cotton plant kind of transforms into money. And in a dominant discourse, it would be probably projected onto the nature-culture division, because first we have the plant, and it's totally natural, and then it transforms into money and becomes cultural. But I wonder if the diagram that we have here on the whiteboard, so is money the virtual potentiality of the plant? Would you say that becoming money is kind of a virtual part of the object of the plant?
Well, boy, that's a tough question. Now, when you say that that 70% of money is cotton, are you talking like physically the dollar bill is mostly made of cotton and then it has like ink in it and these other threads? And right. Okay. I mean, anything can become money, though, right? I mean, it doesn't. It's you know, it can be a certain kind of shell. It can be big rocks, and it can be sheep, and so on. And so, I mean, the way I like to talk about it sometimes is I like to think very much in terms of metabolism. And so, you know, my body ingests all sorts of substances from around it, you know, the food that I eat, the air that I draw in, the water that I absorb, and, you know, my body as a generative mechanism right? It gets in a kind of war with these substances, I guess. Maybe that's not the nicest way of putting it, and it transforms those into cells and the reproduction of my being. And it seems that, right, in order for cotton to become money, you have to have a sort of strange object or entity like economy that metabolizes other things in the world, transforming them into this new entity in much the same way that a body transforms substances into dollar bills. And we've seen increasingly that we don't even need paper money, right? I mean, a lot of us, it's the exception that we use that stuff rather than the rule. It's all digital now. It can be electrical pulses. Thoughts, comments there? Yeah, Jesse?
Yeah, I think for me, maybe it relates back to this idea of potentia that you're speaking of in the case of cotton and money, that we can only know these things based on the relationships they enter into. And maybe that gets at the question that I've been thinking of, and I think someone tried to pose it in another way, and that is what holds things together, like what provides that consistency so that we know, a tree is a tree, or these kind of delineations can happen. And so for me, I've been trying to think about it in terms of that idea of potentia, or the kind of capacity to act, or these kinds of things. So I don't know if you could expand a little bit on that.
We'll talk about that more in the days to come. But while I think one dimension of the of objects is their potentiality, what they can do under certain circumstances, I also think that objects are activities, and that they have to continuously engage in actions and do things in order to sustain themselves as existing. And so there seem to be some types of objects, largely living and social objects, that do this in a quite, I don't want to use the term self-conscious way, but if a salamander loses its tail, it grows it back and everything like that. It tries to maintain a particular pattern or organization through operations of its body within certain limits. And then there are others that they seem indifferent to maintaining their identity across time. The rock is it sustains its being in time through all sorts of forces like electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear force, and everything like that. But if it's chipped, it doesn't grow back, right? That piece of it's chipped apart. And so there's a real, this is something I've tried to emphasize as well. There's a real work that it takes for entities, especially living ones and social ones, to sustain themselves across time. There's all sorts of maintenance. Certainly I'm sure that Tony can attest to this with the news center. Just the sheer amount of time, with the board and the organizers, talking and organizing things and making sure that that entity, that object, continues to exist in time, and then engagement with the broader public, right, which is necessary for a part of that existence. I think that, and this is, I think, was it you that asked about numbers or about ideal entities? It was Bogna, I think. I think that for most entities, not the incorporeals like mathematical entities, but for most entities, entropy is something that they perpetually face. They're in a constant state of the threat of decay, and in some ways this is very hopeful, right? We tend to take entropy as a very negative term, but it's a source of creativity, the chaos or the noise that exists within every entity, but also the possibility of social relations disintegrating and decaying, allowing for new forms of organization to come into existence. But it's also, this real dimension that pattern, which is really what these generative mechanisms are for me, takes work. And I mean work quite literally in the sense that physics uses the term. It requires influxes of energy. It requires activity for these things to continue to exist. Bogna, did you have a remark or?
No.
Okay.
One question I had was about objects. I mean, in the potential of objects, does it include, say, the potential for their own destruction, their own death? I don't know, the description of the high-frequency trading system also sort of brought to my mind the way disease works. I was thinking of the current Ebola outbreak and all of the effects that that has had, and thinking about, well, is it in the potential of Ebola to cause the destruction of other things? How does that fit within this ontology?
I try to think of potential as the production of a quality. Right, so it's a sort of property or state that occurs within a system. System is a synonym for me of object. And I've been writing about it for a long time. It's kind of silly. I have this royal blue glass coffee mug. And, you know, I talk about that coffee mug as populated by all sorts of potentials. And what I mean by that is that if you look very carefully at colored things, they don't just have a color, right? You know, I say the color is a sort of doing on the part of an entity. The color of that mug, it's different shades of blue depending on the lighting conditions that it's in, whether it's under fluorescent lights or out in the sunlight, or in, you know, if I'm having, as I always put it, a romantic moment with my coffee mug and I'm drinking from it in candlelight, or if you turn out the lights, the color of the mug, the shade of blue that it is, or the absence of blue, is an event that takes place as the mug interacts with these wavelengths of light. And so the mug has the potential to color, if we want to use the term as a verb, in various ways. It resides within it in maybe unheard of ways that we don't even know of, right, depending on how it interacts with its regime of attraction around it or its ecology of relationships with these photons of light. And so I want to think of, you know, it's like we might get, you know, Bogna and I might get in a heated debate, right? You know, I'm being an asshole, and, you know, I say, no, the mug is really blue, and, you know, she's being a good oncologist, and she's saying, no, you know, the mug doesn't really have, it has potentials, but it doesn't really have any particular color, right? When the lights are out, it really is black. That's the event that's taking place, because it's not interacting, right? It's not manifesting itself in these ways because those conditions aren't met, right? It's not that in the darkness it really is blue. No, it has the potential to be blue if we turn on the lights or take it out in the sunlight, but it really is black at that point. And so this is the way I'm thinking about the relationship between powers and qualities, what I call local manifestations as qualities. And so I don't know if that sounds like a kind of madness, or, I mean, I like to think of objects as being like these little squeeze stress balls that you have, and, you know, you squeeze it, right, and it changes color miraculously somehow, and it's right. So each object is kind of being squeezed by its interaction with things in the world around it, and is squeezing other things as it interacts with them, producing these events that are these qualities. Kind of a stunned silence here.
Did you say that system is a synonym for object?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure I heard that.
And then we'll talk a little bit later about the different kinds of systems that I think exist.
Is my microphone on? No?
Yes, is that Brian?
Yes. Yeah, I had a question in the group chat because I wasn't sure if this is working. This is working now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess I'll just read it since I already wrote it. But you said that objects take work to maintain themselves, even a rock, for instance. And I have a few questions there. Is this the vitality of the rock? Why does the rock work to persist? To say that the rock strives or struggles to exist.
I think it does persist. All I'm saying is that and it's metaphorical language that I'm using. It makes use of energy. It's expending energy in these atomic processes that hold it together in that particular pattern of existence. Would I go all the way with somebody like Spinoza and say the rock has a conatus, a desire to exist? No, I don't think it wants to exist. I don't think it cares because I don't think it's a living thing. And so, I think we have a spectrum of objects from things that are just completely indifferent to whether or not they exist at all, to things that engage quite consciously and intentionally in maintaining their existence in some way or another, such as we do with our bodies, or a collective political organization that works very hard to maintain its existence across time in the face of a world. People want to wander away or get disengaged, right? And that system has to engage in all sorts of operations and activities to maintain the existence of that over time.
And those are different than the you said, like the equilibrium that the rock sort of has to maintain with the electrons and forces that are at play. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, in that case, it's just laws of physics. It's yeah.
On a related
note, I know lots of people want to be vitalists. I'm not one of those people.
Right. I just want to hear.
I think we lost you, Brian.
Oh no, I was just saying that I was just interested in hearing what your account was of like why the rock was persisting and in what way that was a different, what source it had for its sort of maintenance, and how that source was different than like a more agentic system like
yeah, and I mean and rocks don't really maintain themselves, right? Going back again, rocks are what I call, following Metrono and Varela, they're allopoetic systems. They're not self-organizing. They don't try to maintain their existence. And so if the rock gets chipped, the rock is chipped. It doesn't try and grow back that piece of itself that's missing. It doesn't try to do anything at all. It's just rockish. Right. And so, I mean, I really am one of these people. I don't think that everything is alive. I think life is a pretty rare and special thing that requires very specific conditions to come into existence. And I think it's very important to recognize that. I mean, my ecological commitments, I think we're pretty much stuck on this planet. I don't have much hope unless we manage to upload ourselves to Silicon or something, or interstellar travel that would be required if we destroy this planet. Just if you know much about what space is like and the laws of physics, it doesn't look very feasible. And so I think it's very important to understand that life is not ubiquitous, that it requires very specific conditions, and I think a certain ethics follows from that.
So could I just give one more response then to that?
Yes.
Just real quick. So with the rock chipping itself, so I wonder if it changes if we think of the sort of not being the rock, but just as the individual. If we were looking at inorganic material as just being kind of this one self, which is just inorganic material, and then within that life, then we have organic life, like organic multiple lives. But if we look at inorganic material as just one large life, then maybe that in some way is more to exist in a more willful way. So we might see the chip repair on it if we look at a larger spectrum.
Yeah, that's not a route I would take.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I consider myself a Deleuzian, but I think one of the worst things about Deleuze is that kind of vitalism and this talk of inorganic life and everything. I think it's a real disaster.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can maybe talk about it another time.
I mean, it just makes me twitch.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so I think that's about all we have time for right now. If you could contact me and tell me what route you plan to take over the course of the next 3 weeks, or 4 weeks with your assignment, and maybe even if you wanted, talk a little bit about your projects, that would be terrific. And please, by all means, both auditors and the full students or programmers in the class, please make a point of trying to participate on the course homepage and engage with other people, because that will certainly enrich the experience. And thank you so much for being here and giving me this opportunity to explore ideas with you and share some of my own crackpot ideas as well. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you next Sunday.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.